as many questions as possible at the end of today's session. I will say that the material that Erin's going to cover today is quite detailed and fulsome. So your question may very well be answered by Erin as we go through the presentation. So, but do enter any questions that you have into the chat. And now I'll turn it over to Erin.
Hi, everyone. I'm also just going to say we haven't done, in the interest of time, a full round of introductions, but if you feel like you'd like to, I just, if you wouldn't mind typing in the chat your name, your organization, and if you want to give a land acknowledgement, I just pop mine in there, but that's completely optional for you if you wish to do that. So having said that, I'll get going on our agenda. So we're here today to talk about the T5007 Statement of Benefit requirement. An email went out to all of your organizations a couple of months back with some information and resources, and we're here today to kind of go through it in more detail, talk about why we're doing this, how are we going to do it. We're going to give some examples of the T5007 calculations, talk about some consideration, and have some time for FAQs and the impact of this at the end of the meeting. As Tyler said, if you can type your questions in the chat as we go, or wait to see if it's answered. When we get to the end, we'll have a chance, if you're more comfortable just coming off mic and asking your question, if you're not comfortable typing the question, we will have that opportunity. If we go to the next slide, Tyler. Okay, so why are we here today? I've talked about that. We're here to talk about the requirement for the T5007. What is a T5007? I'm going to go into that in quite a bit of detail. Who's required? By virtue of your organizations being invited to this meeting today, you have at least one operating agreement with BC Housing that has funding that requires this. When are you required to comply, and how can you comply, and what assistance might we be able to give you? Next slide. So BC Housing was notified. So just backing up a little bit, I'm not going to read the whole slide to you here, but in the wake of COVID and COVID response, Canada Revenue Agency was doing a inventory, for lack of a better word. They were doing a jurisdictional review going across all the provinces and territories across Canada to look at all the various COVID responses that each province and territory was doing in order to identify that which of these temporary COVID responses required a T5007 Statement of Benefits or some other type of tax slip. It was through that inventory process that Canada Revenue Agent came to us, and they identified some programs that BC Housing did through COVID and said, and you need to issue them. And we're like, why? Why would we issue those? We've never issued T5 slips in the past. You know, for the past 50 years, BC Housing's never done that. And Canada Revenue Agency pointed at some of our existing programs that weren't COVID programs and saying, well, you must for these programs, right? And we said, no. And then basically CRA told us that we were out of compliance. BC Housing did contract with a tax lawyer. Our tax lawyer went back and forth with Canada Revenue Agency over a period of time because we're like, we didn't see, why do we need to do this? And we also did a jurisdictional review and looked at some of the other provinces and territories. And at the end of the day, CRA said, no, you are out of compliance with the Tax Act. And we checked with other provinces and territories and found out that other provinces and territories are in fact, and have been for years, issuing T5007 Statement of Benefits for programs that are very similar to our scattered address rent supplements. So it became clear that we were out of compliance. We then went some back and forth. We were a little concerned that Canada Revenue Agency was going to make us go retroactive in the past, but they basically said, no, come into compliance. So that's why we're here with you today. We're not any happier about this than you are. I know that none of you are here today excited about this change, but it is what we need to do in order to come into compliance. So what is a T5007 Statement of Benefits? It's basically around social assistance, taxpayer funded money. So the final bullet on this slide, don't need to worry about the section of the Tax Act, but it requires every person who pays social assistance to file an information return to report those payments. And that's using the T5007. So then comes around what is social assistance. So Tyler, next slide. And if you could click one more time, Tyler. So social assistance under the Income Tax Act and Canada Revenue Agency is different than what we think of as support and shelter from social development. It is actually the same thing, but the definition under the Tax Act is any payment made to an individual or third party based on a means, needs, or income test. These include payments for food, clothing, and shelter requirements. These amounts can include actual rental or mortgage amounts paid for accommodation. So that's the actual definition of social assistance. So where this comes in to be is this is talking about when you are supporting a client, an individual, and they're renting in the private market, paying rent to the private landlord. When you have an operating agreement with BC Housing where we are providing funding for you to provide them a rent supplement or assistance to help them pay that rent in the private market, whether you pay it directly to the individual and the individual then pays their full rent to the landlord, or if you pay it directly to the landlord and they just reduce the amount of rent they collect from the individual, that falls under the definition of social assistance under the Tax Act. And we need to issue a T5007 Statement of Benefits if they receive more than $500 during the tax year. This does not apply to purpose-built buildings. So if you have an actual building that you built with an operating budget from BC Housing, you move tenants in and out, it doesn't apply to that unit, but it does apply where the rent subsidy can be moved with the individual. Next slide, please. So now that we know that we have to do it, what do we need to issue for the T5 slip? So the interesting thing is most of what we're getting, you already collect. So to fill out the form, you need the following information: total amount paid and rent supplement. So you should be already tracking how much you're paying each individual under your operating agreement with us. Somebody asked, does this apply to SROs? No, it doesn't, because that's a purpose-built building. Somebody can't move and take their subsidy with them. This is when they're renting a basement suite or an apartment and you're cutting an actual physical check every month. You're not cutting a check to somebody who's living in an SRO, a purpose-built building. So you need the name of the individual, the address that they're living in or their last known address, and the amount they paid. So those first three items on this slide, you should already have. You know, if you're actually physically cutting a check every month to Bob, so Bob can pay his rent in the private market, you should know that you have how much money did you cut to Bob, and you would know what address he's doing now. What you might not have is the social insurance number. So if you don't already have a social insurance number, you should take efforts to collect it. There was an email that went out back in May or June with some information, some guide sheets. We also included a template letter to help you collect the social insurance number. So we will, and we'll send that out to you again after today's meeting. We'll send you all the tools and resources, FAQs, guide sheets, and everything again after today's meeting. So under the Income Tax Act, if you are required to issue a T-slip, you must make reasonable efforts to collect the social insurance number. If you don't have the social insurance number, you still have to issue the T5 slip with the person's name and their last known address, and you just have to put zeros in where the social insurance number is, because when you issue the T5 slip, a copy of it goes to the recipient and a copy goes to CRA. And so you do have to try and collect that. If you have someone that you gave benefits for and they've now left your program and you don't know where they are, you still need to make a reasonable effort to obtain that information, send them a letter, keep a copy of that in your file, because if CRA were ever to audit you to say, why don't you have this SIN number? As long as you can show them we wrote them a letter to their last known address asking for the social insurance number. Next slide. Who is required? So I've covered this again. I'm going to repeat myself a few times here. Any forms to be issued by any provincial, territorial, municipal agency or board or similar body when they make social assistance payments based on a needs or income test. So because you have the operating agreement with BC Housing and it's taxpayer funded dollars that is going out to help people pay their rent in the private market, you need to issue this T-slip. What we will also do following this meeting is we will send to each of your organizations a list of the funding arrangements that the agreements that you have with BC Housing that this requires. So, you know, you won't see your SROs on there, but it'll be anything under, any funds expended under these operating agreements with BC Housing. We'll send you a list of that. Next slide. When are you required to comply? So you need to come into compliance for the current tax year. So Canada Revenue Agency, as we all know from personal experiences, runs on a tax year. So it's January to December every year. So what we are looking that you'll do is you'll issue your first T5007 Statement of Benefits. And it does say no later than February 28th each year. It's actually the last business day of February each tax year. One copy must be sent to the recipient at their last known address, and a second copy must be submitted to CRA. This is no different than your employer issuing you a T4 slip, giving you a copy of your T4 slip for your employment during the year, and they give a copy of it to CRA, because as we all know, CRA has copies of that. The interesting thing here, because I know that our rent supplement recipients are fairly transient, you know, if you're no longer assisting that client and you don't know where they live anymore, you just need to send it to their last known address. If it gets returned to you, moved in the mail, you'll make a note in your client file that the T-slip was returned, and then you can just either securely store that T-slip or shred it. And if the client comes to you, you then would have to generate them another copy, or they could go to CRA and get a copy because CRA will have a copy of it. Next slide. So how do you determine which payments are included in the tax year? So CRA is very clear that it's payments made in a tax year. So if you pay your rent supplements in advance to your clients, if you make a payment at the end of, like right now we're in October. If you were helping somebody with their October rent, did you cut the check at the end of September, or did you cut it at the beginning of October? That doesn't really matter because we're in 2022. Where it starts to matter, if we could go to the next slide, is a bit of an offset. So I'm going to show this to you in a couple of different ways. So here's an example. We have a client and we give them a rent supplement in the private market. They found a new place to rent for December 1st, 2021. And we set them up in the system, and you cut them their very first check in December 2021. And that very first check in December 2021 included their payment for December. And at the end of December, you also gave them a payment for next month for January so that they could pay their January rent on January 1st. But the January rent was paid in 2021. That amount would not be included in the 2022 T5 slip because but then in January you make them a payment for February rent. In February you pay them for March rent. If they continued to receive benefits for the full year, the T5 would be for all payments issued in 2022. So it's when the payment was made, not when it was for. So if we could go to the next slide, we have a bit of a visual here. So at the very top, this is what month we were making the payment for. So, and the row in the middle is the payment made and the amount paid. So we can see the row in the middle says in December of 2021, we paid them $900. That was $450 for December rent and $450 for January rent. In January, we paid them $450 for February, and so on. The two amounts in the red there, the December 21 and the 900, those would not be included in the 2022 T5007. You're just going to include the payments that were made in 2022. So in this case, we have 12 payments and the tax slip is for $5,400 using this example. Once again, we'll be sending you these slides. And so you'll be able to refer back to these. And we have other guide sheets and other information. If we could go to the next slide. This is another example, same thing, where the supplement was initiated in December for the month of December, but we didn't make any payments to them for them until January. And in January, we paid a retro for December, a retro for the month of January, and their February benefit. In this example, we used $280. And if we could just move to the next slide, same layout. The center column here is when was the payment made. We didn't make any payments at all in December 2021. But in January of 2022, we made 3 months worth of payments for December, January, and February. And then we continued to make payments through the full year. So in this instance, they basically got the equivalent of 14 months worth of payments in the 2022 tax year. And that's included because they were physically made. In the previous webinars, one of the questions that came up on a couple of occasions was, well, what if we cut the payment at the end of December, but they didn't cash it till January? We're not going to worry about cashing it. We're not asking you to cross-reference back at the beginning and the end of the year to see if they cashed it. When did you date the payment and make the payment for? So we're not worried about that. It's just you look at what date when did you cut it for? Next slide. So this is a third example. The rent supplement was initiated for March. So this was mid-year. We don't have to worry about the in-between tax years. We made a payment in March for the March and April benefit. And then continued to make payments. But the payment that we made at the end of the May for the month of June was returned by Canada Post because the client moved. And I'm sure if you're administering rent supplements, you've had this happen where you cut a check, you find out that the client moved, you reached out to the client, you can't get a hold of the client, and then you just cancel the payment, remove the client from the program, and now you have an available rent supplement that, depending on the program, you might be able to offer to another individual. So if we can move to the next slide, you're going to see in this one, we made in March of 2022, we made a payment for March and April. And then in April, we made the payment at the end of April for the month of May. And then in May, we sent him a payment for the month of June, but that amount was returned to us. We canceled the check. So in this case, he's only going to get, or he or she, they are only going to get for the amounts that they received. In this case, it was 3 payments. And in this instance, if the client moved without letting you know, you had no contact with the client, it's really going to be in January of 2024 January of, God, I'm sorry, people, I'm losing my mind and my time and space continuum. In February of 2023 is when you're going to be issuing the tax slips for the 2022 tax year. You're going to just be sending that tax slip to the last known address, knowing that it's going to be returned. And then you're going to keep a record of that on file so that you can show CRA that you complied, that you mailed them the tax slip to their last known address. If in the meantime the client contacts you and you're able to get an updated forwarding address, you should make a note of that so that the T-slip can be issued to that address. Next slide. So, as I said, you need to come into compliance for the 2022 tax year, which means by the last business day of February 2023, you'll have to issue the T-slips for anyone who received these social assistance payments during the 2022 tax year. CRA has a very comprehensive guide to the T5007s. We've sent you that link. We're going to send it to you again after this meeting. I would suggest you talk to your organizations. I'm not sure who all is attending this session today, but it may be someone in the accounting or finance department. It may be the group that's issuing your T4 slips for your employment. So your employer organization will have an account with Canada Revenue Agency, and that account they use to file your T4 slips. Someone will need to contact Canada Revenue Agency and let them know that you want your account to be updated to include T5007s, and then CRA will update that and be expecting your T5007s. If we can move on to the next slide, then the question is, how do you submit? So depending on how many clients you have that you're supporting through rent supplements, there are some different options. You only need to do one of these options, not multiple options. So if you have fewer than 50 T-slips, T5007s that you're issuing, you can simply fill out the forms, take a copy of them, mail one copy to each of your clients, bundle the rest into an envelope, and mail it to CRA, and you're done. If you have more than 50 T-slips that you're issuing and less than 100, you can't do the paper version, but you can use the web forms version. They do have a web form where you can actually go in, log in with your organization's information, enter in all the information for the clients, their social insurance number, their name, their address, and submit it that way. And there is also an option for an internet file transfer. If you have more than 100 slips, the only option is doing the internet file transfer. So that's basically creating a report, taking an Excel report, converting it to a type with CFE to have certain columns, and just uploading it using your organization's account number with CRA. Once again, CRA has a really, really detailed online guide that walks you through this process. And BC Housing is also looking to see at what options we can have to help you do some of this information. So if I could have the next slide. Yeah, so I'm going to walk through some of the frequently asked questions, and then we can open up to more questions. So I've talked about this already. What if you don't have the social insurance number? You need to demonstrate a reasonable effort that you got it. Write a letter to the client, keep a note in their file. We sent you a template letter that is just like, dear client, you're getting this benefit. We need to issue a T-slip. We need your SIN number, and we actually provided a form on the back of that. You can use that template, put on your letterhead, modify it, or what other mechanism you have. I also would recommend that if you are allocating a brand new rent supplement to someone, do not activate it without getting the social insurance number first for new clients. So we have to have a process to clean up on the old clients. I'm not saying cut them off if they don't give it to you, but you need to try and collect that. The other question we ask is about securely storing SIN. Social insurance numbers need to be securely stored and protected. You know, somebody just needs a social insurance number for identity theft, so we need to store them. So if you have a secure location, electronic client files, how are you going to store them? You're going to have to make that decision. We do also have, some of you use the HIFIS system to track your rent supplements, and others use Housing Connections. We do have a field in both Housing Connections and HIFIS that you can enter in the social insurance number and then go back in there and get it. So we do have a place at the client level in those systems where you can store the social insurance number. If a client says they don't have a social insurance number or don't know their social insurance number, well, then they're either going to have to apply for one or go get one. In the FAQ documents that we sent out to you, we told you a number of different ways that they can try and get their social insurance number. They can contact CRA. If somebody's on income assistance and receiving income assistance through SDPR, they can speak to their employment and assistance or their disability worker and ask them for their SIN number, because they will have provided it to SDPR in order to get income assistance. And if they don't have a social insurance number, they're going to need to apply for one. If they refuse to give it to us, CRA under the Income Tax Act, any organization that is required to issue any type of C-slips is required to ask for the SIN and keep evidence that they've asked for that. Anyone who is required to provide it for the provision of a T5 slip, so your clients are required to provide it. And if they refuse to provide it, CRA could actually fine the individual for not providing it. So, you know, certainly I think that's why we wouldn't want that to happen to our clients. That's why we need to make sure we get this in before we allocate any new benefits and make sure that existing clients are aware of that. Next slide. So this is the big question, and unfortunately, it's not really easy. So the T5 for the rent supplement that they're getting is not taxable. The amount that's on the T5007 Statement of Benefits goes into gross income, and then it's subtracted out again before taxes are calculated. So it's not taxable. It's not going to increase their taxes that they have to pay. However, it might impact some other income tested tax benefits, such as their GST, Canada Child Benefit, provincial territory tax credits, non-refundable tax. People want us to be able to say exactly how much will it impact, and it's impossible for us to say without seeing somebody's tax return. And we're not experts on all these other programs. So I can't say how much GST is going to be impacted for one client over the other, because it'll all depend on all their other income sources and other details on their tax return. So really, if somebody wants to know how it's being impacted, if somebody's helping them with their taxes, that is the person that they need to talk to about this. And if they're not doing their taxes, they won't be getting any of these things anyhow if they're not completing their taxes. We have been able to confirm, and I know that this was a big issue for those that deal with seniors after some of the issues that happened with CERB and seniors losing their guaranteed income supplement, but we have confirmed that the income on a T5007, if reported properly on the tax return, will not impact old age security or guaranteed income supplement payments. We have been able to confirm that. Next slide, please. So I talked about this a bit already. Social insurance number. If you use Housing Connections or HIFIS, there are fields to store SIN number, and we will look at getting some guide sheets and training on that. This next bullet here, we are actually talking with our IT team about the option of having an Excel extract or a report that you could run yourself out of either Housing Connections or HIFIS that would generate an Excel report that you could use to generate your T-slips. Any report that we generate out of Housing Connections or HIFIS, and I don't have a guarantee that we're going to be able to do this, we're just exploring this right now. But any extracts that we have is only going to be as good as the information that you put into the database. So if your client data isn't updated in Housing Connections or HIFIS, well, then this report won't work. But if your client data is correct, we are hoping that we'll be able to have a report where you could pull it, have all the information, will likely assume an offset that, you know, you're paying each month in advance so that people have it by the 1st, and then you'll have to reconcile that against your payment records, and you might be able to do a mail merge and use that to do the web transfer. So we're looking at that option. More information coming out for you on that. We also have in the Housing Connection system, for anyone who uses the Housing Connection system, we do have the ability, if you have a past client, somebody who's left the program, we have the ability for you to update their mailing address. So if somebody's left the program, you're no longer supporting them, but they give you a forwarding address, we can put that and store that in the Housing Connection system so that you have somewhere for that, if you don't have somewhere in your records. And then we're also working on FAQs, templates, other supporting documents. We do have a website with some general FAQs, supporting documents, and we're going to keep on building up that website. And that website link, or that web page, I should say, will be sent out to you following today's meeting as well. Next slide. This is just a mock-up of what the Excel extract that might look like. You know, of course, this would be one very long Excel list. I broke it into 3 different chunks to show you that, you know, what tax year, what is the total amount, what was the person's SIN number, what was the client's name and address. The little box in the center would be your information, ABC housing provider, and what your address is. That would get merged on the T-slip. Tenancy ref is just our unique identifier in our database. When did the tenant move in? Like, and tenancy start. I know they're not tenants, but this would be the rent supplement start date. Have they left the program? And then the payments. And then you could look at that. But really, the top 2 boxes is all the data that you would need in order to create the T-slip. And we could set it up as a mail merge. And that's what we're working with our Housing Connections team on, to figure out what would the easiest way for us to be able to have some sort of report, and ideally a report that if you're the user, you could just go in, run the report, look at it, do any corrections you need to in the system, run it again. That's what we're hoping we'll be able to do. Next slide. So what are our next steps here? This is our 3rd of 3 webinars with housing providers. We ask, if you haven't already review the documents, the BC Housing FAQs, the guide sheets, and the other information that we've sent to you. If you don't believe this falls under your domain with your role and responsibility, the provider, talk to who. Is it someone in your finance department? Who is it that would be taking on the issuing of these, generating and issuing the T5007? We also want to know, I've talked about a data extract and what help we're able to provide. And, you know, like any organization, we're trying to prioritize and work on things with the biggest impact. So we need to know if you're even looking for our assistance. So following today's meeting, we're going to be sending you a link to a brief questionnaire about the T5007. And one of the questions we're asking is, do you want our assistance with generating a T-slip? Because if nobody wants our assistance, we're not going to dedicate IT resources for it. So we're asking that everyone go into, we're going to send you a link to a little survey. We're going to gather some information from each provider who's been invited to this, who has to do this, to help us know, should we be putting effort into generating a report or extract, and what sort of information are we going to do? We're going to send you a recording for one of these sessions. It might not be this session. We're going to take, we've done 3 sessions. We'll send out one recording to everyone, Q's and A's, and we'll send that all out to everyone. We have also set up a specific email, this T5007 info@bchousing.org. So any questions you have about the T5007 requirement, if you could please send it to that email. We're going to share this email with you again after the meeting today, so that we can gather all the questions related to the T5007 requirement into one place, and make sure that we build out those answers, update our resources and tools as we get more questions.
Great, thank you, Erin. That was great information. Definitely a few questions have popped up in our chat here. And the first question is, does it apply to SRO hotels?
No, not if it's a purpose-built. This is about the scattered address rent supplement that somebody can move from this address to this address and take it with them, and it goes to their landlord. It's not where we have an operating for this building and somebody just goes in and pays an RGI or a flat amount.
Okay, and another question has come up. Would a supplement used for moving costs be included?
We're looking to get final confirmation on that, but I think at the end of the day, I'm thinking it's leaning towards yes, if it's funding that's coming under one of our operating agreements. So if your organization has done some fundraising or has some other funding pool and you're helping with moving costs, or if the moving costs are coming from SDPR, no. But if it's being paid for under the funding agreement with BC Housing, so that is your CHB, HPP rent supplements for anyone has that. HPP rent supplements, the old Homes BC scattered rent supplements. There's a number of different providers here. There's the old federal provincial scattered address rent supplements. We're going to send each of you out a list to say these are the funding arrangements. So under your funding arrangements with us, you have to do an annual reconciliation for your funding arrangements anyhow for those scattered rent supplements. So anything that's covered under those agreements will be there.
Okay, and great. Another question here relating to the SIN, and it says I'm a client who's waiting for a work visa and does not have a SIN.
So you would issue it with zeros, you'd make a note in that file, and you would continue to follow up. And once you have a SIN, because once they have their work visa, once you have a SIN, you would then update your records and do an amendment. So when you read through the CRA guide, it says if you don't have the SIN, you still issue the T-slip, T5007 Statement of Benefits. I keep on saying T-slip, which is kind of different. You would issue it with zeros, and then once you get the SIN, you could just send an amended copy to CRA. You don't have to send it to the client to say, here, we now have the SIN.
Okay, and another question here is, what about when the society rents a house and allows people to live there and use BC Housing funds to cover their rents?
So once again, I'm going to say it depends. I'm going to let you know which funding arrangements this is covered under, right? So it would depend on the funding arrangement. If it's a scattered address rent supplement where somebody can move around, if it's attached to it, I think we might have to. So I think I see that it was Kim Brazil who asked that question. Perhaps you could send that email to the T5007, email that question along with the address and your file number with BC Housing, and then we could confirm whether or not that particular arrangement falls under this.
And this is kind of a related question, and does it apply to HOP clients?
Yeah, so if it's a HOP rent supplement, so think about it this way. If you manage a building and you're the landlord and you collect the rent, it likely doesn't apply. But if you're not the landlord, you're actually helping someone locate a rental in the private market by looking in the local ads, Craigslist, this and that. They're signing an agreement with a private landlord, and they're renting the place for $1,000 a month, and you're giving them $400 a month or $450 a month towards the rent supplement. They're paying the difference. That's when you do that, because that rent is going to that landlord and they're paying the difference. If that person then gives their notice and moves from this address to another house 3 blocks away, and you move the rent supplement with them, then that's what it covers. But if it's an operating budget, so, going back to Kim, I'm not sure what funding arrangement that was. We'll have to look at that. But it's usually those scattered address portable rent supplements where it's allocated to the individual, not the address, and it can move with the individual. And if that individual moves, it's allocated to a different individual, potentially at a different address.
Is our T5007 is acquired for on reserve housing?
Well, once again, it goes back to what I'm just saying. We're going to tell you which funding arrangements we have that are required under the T5007. So if we are giving a T5007 and somebody's renting something on reserve, but it's really about our funding arrangement, there might be other tax treatment if they live on reserve, and that's between them and CRA. I'm not 100% sure.
And here's another, does the T5007, is it applicable to rent supplements, or does it include other social assistance programs?
So can you confirm, what do you mean by
That
other
was
social assistance?
Sure, that was
Joey?
from Joey. Yeah, maybe Joey, you can just unmute yourself if you want a clarification on that.
Yes. So I knew that like in the previous slides that you presented, it shows the like a sample of the social assistance. And so, like, for instance, the food, clothing, and shelter, and that could also include the rental. And so, for the purpose of issuing the T5 slip, I would like to know whether do I just need to focus on the actual rental, or if in the event that my company also provides like food and other social assistance, that will need to be added to the amount that needs to be reported.
I'm only requiring you to do it for the funds that come out of your operating agreement with BC Housing. Right? So if you have a rent supplement portion and agreement with BC Housing, you have file number 1, 2, 3, 4 to give up to 15 rent supplements to individuals, the money that you expend under that. If you're also giving other money from other sources, I think you need to look at where do those other sources come from, and you may need to ask, you may need to ask your tax lawyer or check with CRA directly. I know that the rent subsidy money that comes from BC Housing does fall as social assistance because that's taxpayer funds, and the government of Canada wants to know how much taxpayer funds is going in to assist low-income households, and that's part of how they do it. They have that. If you have other amounts that you're paying, I guess the question is, where does that funding come from? And you might need to consult with your tax accountant or something on that to say, is there a chance that this should also get it? I don't know. I know that the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction issues T5007s for support and shelter payments that they do give to all income assistance and disability assistance recipients.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Joey. Another question here. Do utilities fall under shelter for the T5007?
Yeah, so I think this falls sort of under the same thing. If it's paid for out of our operating budget, our subsidy under the agreement with BC Housing. So if you're helping someone with their utilities and including that in their rent supplement payment, and it's coming from the funding source from BC Housing under the operating agreement with us, yes.
Another question here. I'm just going to try. This is a longer one, but I'll just read it out for you. Say we have a one-time supplement for someone in the amount of $500, and we issue the T5007, and then 6 months later find out the check was never cashed and is now stale dated, and the client cannot be located. Do we have to do an adjusted T5007 to reverse the amount?
Yeah. So in the CRA guide, there's all sorts of different things about that. So if you actually stale date it, cancel the check, you can actually do what they call a canceled T5007. So it's like just same thing and change it. On the T5007 tax slip, there's 4 different types of tax slips. O is the original, meaning this is the original one that we issued. You can issue a duplicate to say, somebody phones you up and says, my dog ate my tax slip, can you give me a copy of it? You can just issue it again and say that this is a duplicate, and you don't need to actually submit a duplicate to CRA. You can just give the duplicate to the client, but you need to mark it as duplicate. You can do an amended. So if, let's just say, here's an or a canceled. So to answer your question, I'm going to do the canceled one, this example. One-time rent supplement for $500, they never cashed it, and then you realize that, yes, you could then generate the T-slip or pull a copy of the T-slip, write canceled on it, mail it to CRA to say this has been canceled, they never got them money. And then that way, if they file their taxes in the future, it's being canceled. The other option is, what if you sent it out to somebody, you send somebody a T-slip for, and this happened to us for our SAFER program. I send somebody a T-slip for all the money that was issued in 2022. But then I realize the client passed away near the end of the year last year. And the estate of that client came back and said, you know what? We're just going to pay you back all this money out of the estate because it's easier than refiling their taxes. Then we could do a cancellation. But if they only paid us back part of it, say we never cash these, we would then have to do an amendment to reduce the amount on the T-slip.
Thanks, Aaron. Another question here. How long do we need to keep the documentation that we'd requested for the recipient's SIN?
So I think you need to look at your document retention records. I don't even think it's necessarily about the document requested for the recipient's SIN. Under sort of document retention, FOI privacy, when you provide somebody with a financial benefit and a service, you're required to keep all the information related to that client file. And this isn't just about the SIN. You're required to keep that client file for as long as you provide them a benefit, plus 7 years. So I think I would just treat it like you would anything else in that client file.
And another question has come in. I think you've answered this one, but does this apply for all rental subsidies given out from other grants or funds?
Yeah, so just to answer, I can only speak for the funding that we're provided, that's the taxpayer provided funding. If you have other grants or funds that you have gotten from other locations, I would really recommend that you speak to whoever does your taxes and ask for their advice to figure out how would that fall under Canada Revenue Agency.
Yeah, and another question here related to that chart we had up about submitting forms electronically to CRA. Can we submit it electronically even if there are fewer than 100 clients? So I think it said paper. But if they're saying can we just go ahead and submit it electronically regardless?
Absolutely. So if you look, and you're going to see the slide, if you looked at the 0 to 50 or 1 to 50, you could do it by paper or web forms or electronic. One of the three, not all three. But the moment that you were between 50 and 100, paper is no longer an option. You can do web forms or an electronic upload. And then once it's over, you only have one option. So yeah, you don't have to do the paper. You do have those three options, but it's one of.
Great. Okay, and I think you've already answered this question about the child tax credit. Another question, what about living in a hotel?
If you're providing them with a rent supplement to offset the cost of the hotel, yes. So if they're paying a monthly amount that's greater than 30% of their income, and you're cutting a check to them or to the landlord directly, and it's a portable rent supplement, so if they decide to move out of that hotel to a basement suite down the street or a different private market hotel, yes. And that, once again, this comes back to, if it's funds, if that payment is being made out of one of the operating agreements with BC Housing that we've identified as a scattered address rent supplement, yes.
Okay, great. And another question here, does this, sure, I understand this one, does this requirement apply to single payments?
If that single payment is more than 500. So if somebody received one payment for $450, no. One payment for $500, no. One payment for $501, yes. If it's under one of those funding envelopes. I know I'm saying that over and over, and we'll send you a list to say these are the funding envelopes that if you're paying any money out under these, that we need to do the rent supplement for.
There was a series of questions here about the amount, and it relates to that $500 figure you were just mentioning, Aaron. And it's saying, so it's under or over, and what I'm hearing is it's 500 or over. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it says if you read the CRA, and I'd have to go back, it's over 500. So $501, issue a T-slip, $500, no.
I think you kind of answered this one. Is what about funds given to support education, tuition, books, etc.? I think you've already answered that, but
yeah, and I don't think any of that would come under our agreements, because our agreements I don't think would cover that. Once again, I'm talking about the funding, but if you are giving funding around those and it's based on a means, needs, and income test, that's where I think you need to talk to whoever helps your organization with your taxes. Where is that money coming from? And does that meet the CRA requirements?
So that's all the questions that were in the chat. If there are any other questions, folks, feel free to unmute yourself or just drop it in the chat. We have a few more minutes. Somebody says, yes, HPP has a tuition, etc. section. Okay, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so just around the question about 500, I just re-Googled to check, because you do these things so much often, and you were Canada Revenue, people who receive more than 500. So $500 and less, no T-slip. 501, T-slip.
Yeah, and I see that Kim has a question. Go ahead, Kim.
So just to clarify then, so scattered housing, obviously those ones where you're paying it directly to the landlord on top of the tenants. And then in that cases where, because I had to step away for a second, where we might be the society renting the house on behalf, but paying using a BC 100 housing contract that's funded to the society to pay those rents, that again would be treated as rental income for them.
Rental income?
Sorry, it's treated as like have to be put on the T slip. Like if it's like we're renting the house, but we're
Yeah.
also using your rental contract with BC Housing to fund those tenants' rent.
Yeah, so likely. So if we can confirm. So once again, we're going to send you the file number. So we have what we call a scattered address rent supplement. If you've chosen to take one of our scattered address rent supplement and rent a home and then sublet it to someone, yes, it would still follow. If we entered into some sort of different agreement where we're like, this subsidy can only belong at this address, it might not. So if you could just email us to the T5007 email and confirm about the actual building, we can confirm yes or no.
It might be a house that we're using, like we're getting a rental program, like, but we've rented the house that you don't even know about. So we, as a society, rented the house, but you guys have given us a funding contract, like to specific with Phoenix. So we have the contractor. Now I've said who it is.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Why don't you just send us the file number and we can confirm.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. So as Aaron mentioned, we're going to have all of the recording and a bunch of materials we'll send out to you after today's webinar, just to have all the information, as well as that email address that Aaron mentioned, the T5007 email address to ask any further questions. We're here to support. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to have you on board. And oh, sorry, Aaron, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, so just one more question popped up. So I'm just going to quickly show. The question popped up, said on the T5007 tab 10 worker, would you put HPP rent supplement? So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. I just have a mock-up. This is from the CRA website. So this is the T5 state. So here, tax year 2022. You would not put anything in box 10 because you're not workers' compensation. This is social assistance payments or provincial or territorial supplements. So the amount that you paid to the individual would be here. So it'd be 2022, $501. Social insurance number would go here, or 0000009 zeros if you don't have the social insurance number. Report code will always be O for original. Recipient's name, Bob Smith. Recipient's last known address. Payee's name, ABC Housing Society, your address, tax slip done. Right? You know, if you happen to be an organization that has one contract with BC Housing for 10 scattered address rent supplements, you might decide to print this out and handwrite this out by hand, send out the 10 to the clients and send your copy to CRA, you know, and Bob's your uncle. But if you have 200 or 300 rent supplements, you're not going to handwrite them. You're probably going to be looking at doing them. So there's not a lot of information. It is, the form itself is in triplicate, you know, because, you know, think about when you get your T-slip, you have so it repeats many times. But yeah, if you only have a handful of rent supplements, you might just decide to handwrite them out. But if you have more, you're going to probably looking and thinking about, do you want to ask BC Housing, how are you going to do the extract? Could you do a mail merge? That information. So you don't put, box 10 will be blank. This is the total dollar amount in here. And social insurance number, report code. If somebody calls you and said their dog ate their tax slip, if you kept a copy of this in your file, you could take a photocopy and write duplicate here and give them a duplicate copy. If you get the SIN number at a later date, you regenerate and you change the report code from O for original to A for amended, and you send a copy to CRA.
Okay. Oh, sorry, there's another question that's popped up. After the form is complete, is there an option to email to CRA?
No. There is not an option.
And a related question, are we going to create our own report code?
No. We all know what it's like working with CRA. We're not going to be able to create our own report code. This is a CRA requirement. They want to know when they receive a copy, is this the original or is it an amendment or is it a cancellation? That's what they want, because they match this up to all the taxpayer records and files. So we're not going to be able to do a report code. Option to email to CRA, no. Tyler had in the slide deck, and you're going to get the slide deck that, you know, if you look at the T5007 statement of benefits, I'm just on CRA's website. This is their statement of benefits, and this goes, you can read through this, but it is quite detailed, and it talks about who has to file, what do you have to report, you know, payments for food, clothing, and shelter requirements. So I think I noticed somebody else said food on there. So really technically, so if it's, I'm saying that for each of your funding agreements with us, where it's the BC Housing is providing you the money to hand on, that amount needs to go. And then it does talk in here around filing methods. You must file it online if you file more than 50 slips. If you file less than 50 slips, you can still do it online. But if you have more, you have to do it online. And by online, you can do it two ways. You can do a web form. So their web form is you can actually go in, log in, you type in all the information and can print the slips. So you could, if you have less than 100 slips, you could just go into their web forms, take your information, type it all in, and it'll actually help you print the slips in a summary for you, and you could just click submit to CRA. But if you have more than 100 forms, you have to do it by an internet file transfer, which means that you have to send them a form in an XML format. But you take it, start with an Excel list that has name, address, and then you convert that to an XML. We'll give you some, and they actually give you some instructions on here on how to do it as well. And then you just upload it, but you need to do that using your organization's account number with CRA. So if you're the, you know, and this for each of your organizations, it might be you that needs to go through and read this and figure out how it works. It might be talking to somebody in your finance or accounting department who might take on this process for you if you give them the information. But a lot of the questions are answered by going through this document, which is in the link with the data of all the information that we're going to send out to you.
Great, thank you, Erin. And I think we're going to be sending that document next week because we have another one of these sessions on Friday. So we'll get it out following that sometime next week. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today, and have a great afternoon. Thanks again.
Thank you.